Hi, everybody. Dr. Jenny Sue here. I am always looking for ways to teach smarter, not harder. And one of those ways to teach smarter is to integrate our topics. Elementary teachers have a lot to do in their classrooms. And so when I'm looking through the curriculum guides, I'm looking for opportunities of how I can integrate skills and use science as a way to practice or reinforce those skills. But I also look for ways within, say, for example, the social studies curriculum. How can I connect science to social studies so that when we're learning about ancient civilizations or even just places like Jamestown, I could be looking at ecosystems or I could be looking at scientific processes. So, in this quick video, I want to share with you a lesson activity that connects ancient Egypt and allows your students to design and experiment. Now, if you've been following me for a while, you know that I like to start off with activities first, investigations that allow kids to observe some things. And from those observations, then we can design experiments. So I'm going to put up a picture here in just a second. And I want you just to kind of look at these two objects in the picture. And when we come back, we'll talk about them. All right, what'd you think? Are you curious? Okay, so here's what's really cool about that picture. So you have two apples. The one on the left was one that had just set out in a plastic container on the counter for 7 weeks. And you can see, if you go back in the video and look at it, it's kind of like looks old. There's mold on it. It looks gross, right? Let's be honest. It's gross. But the one on the right, you probably looked at and went, wow, that must be just freshly cut. No, that was one that has actually been in salt. It was wrapped in gauze and it was mummified, and it's been sitting in salt for the same amount of time as the other one. So, this whole activity is getting into how the ancient Egypt culture mummified their pharaohs. And it's a great way that you can have the kids start looking at how civilizations have customs and rituals that occur within that civilization. So, I'm going to show you in just a second how you set up this investigation. Now, what you want to do is have your kids watch the other video that I've created. I've created it just specifically for them so that it'll help them to be able to kind of set this up. But you know what's going to happen because obviously I'm telling you right now. But so the investigation question that you want to pose to your students, to your kids, if you're doing this at home, is you want to pose the question, what happens to an apple when we put it in salt, when we mummify it for 7 weeks? What happens to it? So we just want to have the kids look at that question, right? So we're not designing an experiment just yet. We're just learning. So I like to call this descriptive research. So we're going to find out and be able to describe what happens when we put an apple that's wrapped in gauze in salt for 7 weeks. Now, if you want to, you can put out just a regular apple slice next to it so that at the end of the 7 weeks you can get the same picture like I have. And you just put it anywhere in your kitchen, on your house, put it somewhere that it's not gonna be in the way or anything like that. So you're probably thinking, well, Jenny Sue, am I going to get bugs? So the number of times that I've done this, I've never had a problem with it. I usually just stick it, on the counter in the kitchen. And that way, my kids, when we did this together, they could come in and they could look at it. You don't want the children to take out the apple slices from the salt. So just leave it alone, but have them make observations. And there is a recording sheet that I'll post a link to that you can download, and your students can, just record observations. So again, our investigation question that we're going to be looking at is what happens when we take an apple and we wrap it in gauze and put it in salt over 7 weeks. So let's look at how you set this up. Okay, so these are the materials you're going to need for this first investigation. Remember, our investigation question that we're going to be exploring is what happens to an apple when it is placed in salt for about 6 weeks. So that's what we're going to be investigating, is what happens to this apple. How does it change over those 6 weeks when it's wrapped in gauze and it's placed in salt? So you're going to need an apple. You're also going to need an adult to help you, because we're going to need to cut the apple into small pieces. You're going to need some sort of gauze to mummify your apple. You're going to need salt, and you're going to need a container. The other piece we're going to need to do is we're going to need a scale in order to find the mass of our apple before we begin. So I'm just going to go ahead and start cutting this. And what we want to do is you want to get it into quarters. So I just want to take a small, and these are actually apples that we found when we were on a camping trip. So they are out of a tree that was in the camping area, and so I thought they were cute, so I still have them. Wanted to collect the seeds. So you need a piece just like this. So we are going to find our mass, and we need to record this. So this is 8 grams. So we are starting with our apple at 8 grams. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, let me move this out of the way. I'm going to take, and I want to put down just a little bit of salt. Again, remember, the Egyptians used a naturally occurring material in their environment called natron. And so we're going to take our little apple piece and we're going to mummify him by just wrapping it up just like that. Okay, so we have wrapped him in a cloth just like the Egyptians would do. And I'm going to set this down into our salt. And then I'm going to cover it just like that. And now I'm just going to leave this for 7 weeks, and we're going to see what happens to our apple at the end of that 7 weeks. So that's our investigation question. What happens to the apple after it's been sitting in salt for 7 weeks? So check back later and let's see what your apple and what my apple is doing in 7 weeks. Easy, right? Yeah, it's probably one of the easiest activities once you just get the materials and set it up, and you just let it go. And they just make observations for 7 weeks. Now, here's how you'll turn it into an experiment after you do this first observation, right? Because again, I'm always looking for ways that our students can practice the experimental design, thinking about how do I manipulate variables so that I pick one, and that's what I, as the researcher, choose to vary, the independent variable, right? So I vary it, independent variable. Did you see what I did there? Great way for the kids to remember. So we pick one factor that we're going to change to see how it affects the outcome. And so that outcome that we're going to be looking at, that is our dependent variable, because it depends on what we vary. See what I did there again? So your dependent variable is your data that you're collecting, and it depends on what you're changing. All right, so what you're going to do is you had your students or your own children put the apple into kosher salt. So what could we change about our materials? If I have salt, what could I change? Well, here's the interesting piece. If you have your children research the Egyptian culture, you'll find that when they mummified their leaders, they used a naturally occurring substance called natron. And natron is a little bit of salt, but it also is calcium carbonate, which we know to be baking soda, right? So baking soda has calcium carbonate in it. So you could give your students, or your children, that piece of the material that we use to mummify, and what could we change about it? So we use salt, but what if we had different types of salt? What if we had combinations of salt with like baking soda? How would that make a difference? So you could actually have, so like if I'm doing this in the classroom setting and I've got 5 groups and my students brainstorm, they want to use table salt or maybe pink Himalayan salt. Maybe they want to use a combination of baking soda and salt, or maybe they just want to use baking soda. I now have 4 different variables that each group, and I would need a 5th one, obviously, if I had 5, but I would have those different variables that each table could pick a variable, and each table's doing their own unique experiment. And then at the end of the next 7 weeks, they report out their findings like real scientists. And again, it's a way that you can practice designing a testable question. So what could I change about our materials? And I could list, the material that's used to mummify. And I could say, well, we use salt. So what could we change about salt? And then I'm going to ask the students, well, what will we observe or measure? And they're going to say, well, we'll look at how the mass changes of our apple over time to see if it makes a difference. Or maybe we'll look at so there's the quantitative measurement, getting that actual mass change. Or maybe it's qualitative measurements. We want to look at how the skin looks and the flesh of the apple. Does it look like it's still able to be eaten, right? So those are the dependent variables that you're going to be collecting. So your testable question becomes, what's the effect of changing the substance that I put the apple in? And I could say pink Himalayan salt, on how the apple looks and its changes in mass. So again, kind of fun way to turn an activity into a science experiment really quickly. So have fun doing this one with your kiddos. It's a great one to do long-term research. And it's also a great springboard, like I said, to get into looking at how cultures, and especially that Egyptian culture, what they believed about death, why did they mummify their pharaohs, and then comparing it to, what does our culture do? How is it different? And then you could look at Greece, you could look at Rome. Did they have any specific traditions around, when people died? So have fun doing science with your kids. Thanks for joining me.